Okay, good afternoon. No, I shouldn't walk around. Okay, so this talk is going to be on geolocation in Drupal. Just a few things about it real quick, just to make sure we're in the right spot. Is the introduction this talk is going to be an introduction to mapping in Drupal. It's not going to be a really deep dive. It's going to be how to get maps into Drupal, how to get points into those maps, and then also how to find where your users are by the IP address or where they are physically located based off of whatever device your user's using. So if you're looking for something super technical, probably not the talk for you. If you're getting into mapping with Drupal, probably the talk for you. Nobody left, okay. So my name is Andrew Riley. I'm a Drupal consultant at MediaCurrent, and I've done probably about 6 Drupal sites that have had some form of mapping or geolocation for users or locations. It seems to be more of a rising trend that big companies want to show all the stores that sell product X or something along those lines. And to write a system yourself is pretty complicated, but you can use some of these modules that you're seeing here to be able to implement it. So if you're just getting into geocoding, or excuse me, into mapping, you're going to find a bunch of different terms that are pretty scary. This one is GIS, which can actually stand for about 3 different things. So you can have graphic information system, geographic information system, geographical information science, or geospatial information studies. And a short version is you're trying to put points on a map. So I'll give you a brief summary. The other thing is at the end of this, I do have links for you to be able to view this slideshow. So if you want to save yourself some writing. The next one is geolocation. So geolocation is actually a kind of interesting one. It's dual mode. So you have an object in this physical world. Let's just say this conference center. Or in this case, a cell phone or an internet-connected computer terminal. That is either finding out where that is, that location, or it could be the location. So everything is represented on a base level by latitude and longitude. You have your north, your west, and you've probably seen those numbers before. The systems can actually store it in different ways, but we're not going to get into that too much. But geolocation is where that lat and longitude is at kind of its lowest level. I tend to use this next term, geocoding. That is the act of looking up where something is. What is that lat and longitude? There are systems that do geocoding for you. And this is actually one of the harder parts of doing mapping in any website. Because a lot of times your user will enter in, well, I want to find a store by 123 Easy Street. Well, it's up to your geocoding service to figure out where 123 Easy Street is. Is it 123 Easy Street in Florida? Is it 123 Easy Street in Georgia? There could be a lot. So geocoding is a kind of a complex item that we're going to be using, but the good news is there are free services out there that you can use. So just to recap, GIS, that's your system for mapping points and interacting with points in your maps. Geolocation, that's your real-world object of coordinates, and geocaching, that's actually looking up what those coordinates are for your real-world objects. So let's talk about actually creating a map in Drupal. There are multiple modules that will do it for you. There's the Gmap way, which I kind of consider the older way to do it. It's been around for at least since the Drupal 5 days. They have a Drupal 7 alpha out. And you use a location module, which creates the field for you, and use the Gmap module that actually puts the map on screen. I'm not going to go too in-depth into this one. I am going to go more in-depth about the OpenLayers way. OpenLayers, at its lowest level, is a JavaScript library that ties in with some other open source projects that provides a way for you to put points on a map and load maps at its lowest level. It can do a whole bunch of other stuff. But for this introduction, That's probably the best way to explain OpenLayers. Now then we also have the GeoCode module, we're going to be going into that, and the GeoField module. Don't be too discouraged if it's a little confusing, because half the modules that tend to deal with OpenLayers start with the word geo. It gets a little confusing. So let's talk about the actual map display. That's OpenLayers. It's kind of changed from its older 1x days to its 2x days. It's just the way to put a map on the screen. That's it. You can have a lot of settings, and I'm going to show you them, for the maps, but it really focuses on displaying your maps. Now, one of the nicer points with it is it integrates with views. So you could say, I want to see all the public stores in Georgia and have all those pins show up on the map with a view. So you don't have to totally learn all the crazy things like the Haversheen formula and other scary things that come with GIS.
You may have mentioned this before I walked in, but that's dependent upon Google Maps or Google API?
OpenLayers can use actually just about any map out there. It can use Yahoo, Google Maps, it can use, can't remember the default open one that it comes with, and you can add in additional ones.
But I guess my point I want to make, it does not require you to load your own geospatial data in MySQL.
For individual points?
For any maps or anything, even the points.
No, you could just say, I need a Google map, and it'll put a Google map up there for you. Then you could add points or polygons to it, but that's entirely up to you how you use that map.
But you don't have to.
No.
Does it support clustering? OpenLayers?
OpenLayers does have an extension.
You have 1,000 items that will take and cluster down into.
It has an extension to tie in with a special server that will do a lot of the clustering and rendering
So it
with
does
it.
not use the GMAP3 cluster.
No.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a good thing to bring up. So what he's talking about is clustering. So let's say you're looking at, I don't know, 5 miles around here, and you want to see all the stores that start with the letter A. There could be 2 around here. But then you go to New York City, you could have 1,000 in a square block. You have degraded performance when you start putting those 1,000 pins on a Google map or any type of map you're using. Yeah, so clustering is the concept of saying, well, there's a lot of pins right here. I don't need to show you everyone. I'm going to represent that there's a cluster here. You can zoom in further to see which pins are where and hopefully reduce the result set that you're returning. So that's clustering, and that's actually one of the biggest difficulties that you have if you have a large data set with GIS, is just how to display either sparse information or very populous information. So with the OpenLayers modules, you have the GeoField. If you're familiar with Drupal 6, it's kind of like the location module. This module, it just creates a new field type for you to add to your content type. It does have flexible output, which I'll show in the demo portion, which is pretty handy. You can have it display the GeoField as a map. You can have it display as latitude and longitude. There's about 8 by default ways to show or display the field. And it does tie in with the next module we're going to be talking about, GeoCode. This is the one that I talk about that does a lot of the complex lookups. So if you're adding a store content type and you start typing in the address, the GeoCode module is the one that does the heavy lifting to determine if it can find the latitude and longitude of the address that you're putting in there.
Is that, does that use Google Maps API, or is that its own separate?
You can specify a few different ways to pull information.
It's an interface, you can determine which implementation you want to use, essentially.
That's correct. For geocoding, I tend to use the Google one because it's free, and as far as free ones goes, it's pretty good.
Can you do proximity search?
Oh, that's going to be coming up in just a minute. I'll talk about proximity searches. The other thing is user experience. When you go with a GeoField, there's 2 ways that you can really enter in your information. You can have a map there and someone drags it over, finds the spot they want and clicks there, and that enters in the information. or you can have them enter an address and let the geocode do the lookup information. I tend to think that the geocoding is a better user experience just because the person can type in an address, which is very easy for someone to remember, very quantifiable, and have the geocoder look it up. There are a few negative things, like geocoding can be a little bit wonky outside of the United States. So if you're in England and you type in an address, it might not return the right results, or it might be 100 miles off. So keep that in mind, that if you're going to be outside the US, geocoding, maybe not a good thing. Or if you're going to be mapping something that doesn't have an address, if you're mapping your favorite tree in the middle of the woods, there's not going to be a street address for that for Google to look up for you.
Help me understand, if you're looking for a user experience that has nothing to do with displaying a map, and you just wanted to enumerate the customers in a particular zip code, which one of the modules would apply? And that's not an OpenLayers function.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use OpenLayers for that. You could, but that's a little bit of added complexity. If you just wanted to find the users in the zip code, based on if you're using like something like the profile module, you could use views to pull back their information based on a field.
Well, but okay, that was a bad example, but a particular region or a voting district where you didn't have an identifier. I mean, it'd be a simple SQL statement, but
yeah,
there's like the shape data from the U.S. Census.
Yes.
Now there's a geo module, and I know you didn't mention that, probably because it's crap. Which, you know, people have abandoned that for OpenLayers, but I don't see how to accomplish that.
There's two different ways that it can be, well, not two different ways, but two ways that work together. With OpenLayers, it can import KML files, which is a good way to get like your census data. And KML is just kind of like a pre-populated, you could do outlines, you could do points, it can have a lot of different information in there. So you could create a bounding box, even irregular, polygon shape. OpenLayer does allow you to select areas. So if you wanted to, you could go through and click and make one, you know, the shape of Rhode Island if you wanted. So it does have those options. I'm not going to get into it too much because that's definitely higher level stuff, but it is possible.
With the OpenLayers.
Yes. Okay, so proximity, you asked about this. And this is a very popular one. I'm sad to say it is not working in Drupal 7 currently. So a proximity search is, I want to find all of the Publixes within 5 miles of where I am or within this zip code. Right now, it's just not there for Drupal 7. For Drupal 6, there is an OpenLayers module for it. Just be warned, sometimes it can have some issues. So definitely test it out. The other option, and please no one be scared, is you can write your own. There's a thing called the Haversine formula that allows you to calculate, well, roughly calculate within X miles how many points fall in with that. If you Google for it and you search for Haversine MySQL, you'll get a query already written that you can basically drop into a module you're writing. So let's talk about locating your users. Now, when your users sign up for your website, you can ask them for their address, and you can geocode that like you could just any address using OpenLayers and GeoField and all those modules. But what about anonymous users, or you know, just trying to find out a user where they are without, you know, asking them for their address? What happens if they're like me, live in Orlando but happen to be up here in Atlanta? So why would you want to do that? I've run into a few different ways to do it. A lot of sites that have to work with e-commerce or things like that won't sell in certain countries or won't sell certain items in certain countries. So you can actually hide and change the options depending on where they happen to be located. You can also redirect the user to a version of a different, or the same site. So if for some reason you have someone from England who's hitting your site, the US version, you could redirect them over to the British version of the site. I'm not talking language-wise, but actual, you know, different site. You also have better user identification and just better user experience. It's a lot nicer when you go to a site and you're looking for the Publixes around you if it already knows where you are. So that's just a nice little handy thing that you can do for your users. Little note about that last example I gave you. When you're using OpenLayers, there is an option for it to center based on where the user is. It is not working by default in the current version of OpenLayers and of the OpenLayers module with the OpenLayers 2.10 version of the JavaScript. You're going to have to write a little bit of JavaScript to be able to move the map. So just keep that in mind.
Geolocation to do that.
You could, I'm going to show you a module that will pull that information for you, and then you can just recenter it.
So JavaScript's turned on, well, the map's going to blow up, right? So
There are many ways you can do that, and that happens to kind of move into these next two slides. So how do you actually do it? First, you want to find out the user's IP address. You want to look up the IP address in some type of table or service, and then you want to figure out which country they're in from that lookup. Now, there's actually a couple different ways that you can look up this information. You might be using JavaScript to access some of the HTML5 ways. You might be using an external service. There are three questions that tend to play into this, and that is, will you be using this on mobile? How much money do you actually want to spend in looking up where these users are? And can you process the data at a later date? Are you going to be doing something offline, like comparing your users for some of the census information? So those are kind of three big questions that you want to do to kind of figure out how you want to do it. So there's a couple different ways. This one is probably the one that falls under the radar the most. Google Loader is a JavaScript that Google puts out that lets you load certain JavaScript libraries or Google Maps API and that type of thing directly from Google servers. If it can, it will actually send back an object that gives you the user's country, tries to give you address information, well, down to city level, and tries to give you latitude and longitude. Now, I say tries. It doesn't always work, even here in the US. And outside of the US, it's very spotty at best.
And by reliable, you mean, can you detect when it failed, or does it just fail?
You can detect when it fails because you're already requesting the JavaScript. You see, does that object exist? If not, go on to next method. So the nice thing about this is it's free and it's unlimited queries. So if you get 1 million hits a day, it's not going to cost you anymore. They're not going to turn you off. So it's pretty good. But again, you can't kind of use it by itself if you're going to be relying on it. Next one is HTML5 Geolocation. And this one you might have seen more on your mobile than on a local device, but the modern browsers are starting to support it more and more. It's free, but one of the main drawbacks is it pops up a little warning like, you know, so-and-so website wants to use your location. That's probably a little scary for most users. They're like, why is the public's website want to see my location? So as users get more educated about that, it'll probably be a little less worrying, but right now the odds are they'll probably say no.
So that's built into the browser?
Yeah, built into Chrome and Firefox. I don't know about IE9 currently, and those will give you a rough, for the browsers, it will give you a rough resolution, so it's about, on average, about 6 blocks of where you currently are. But if it does happen to turn on the GPS, let's just say you're using it on your cell phone, you have your GPS enabled, it will return the fine latitude and longitude, if it can, down to the lowest resolution possible. I guess highest resolution possible. So pay databases and services. There are databases out there that you can buy. I don't know, I'm thinking they range from about $99 to a couple $100. That essentially it's a database that you put in your MySQL, Postgres, whatever you're using, and you pass it the IP address of the person, and it returns you the data. They usually cost more for the more data they're going to return you. The country version would probably be about the $99 version. The country plus city plus state plus a couple other things would be more expensive. The good news is even the lowest level country one will still return latitude and longitude for most services. If you're using an external service, let's say you don't want to load that to your database. You don't want to load 2 gigs of IP addresses into your database. There are some services out there that you can make an API call. It sends them the IP address and it sends back the information. Some are free, some cost money. There are varying quality levels. And also with mobile locations. I actually just retested this last night. I live down in Florida. I'm up here in Atlanta. I checked it, and one of the services said that I was actually in Virginia. That is where my IP address is registered. That's not where I physically am. So keep in mind that all of these can definitely have their pros and cons. Now, what's really the solution? You know, if you can't really trust it, do you want to use it? I recommend using at least 2 methods. I prefer to use all 3 if possible. But if you use 2, one, you can check them against each other. But also, if one fails, you at least have some type of backup. The other thing is, if it's mission critical for your site to be able to detect the location, you might want to just rethink some of your approaches. I tend to use it as an enhancement. It makes the user experience better, or it shows the thing, or it hides the things that they can't buy. But I still usually have another check, just because even every once in a while you will get all of them to fail at once. Now, right here at the bottom is the Smart IP module. It's a relatively new module that I found out. And if you tie it in with the device geolocation module, it'll go through a couple of the methods that I just talked about. It'll pop up the HTML5 method to see where you are. If that's not available, then it will try hitting the Smart IP service that will return where you're located. So that's pretty cool, and the Smart IP service is free. One small detractor about this: you have to code to use this. That Smart IP module just provides the information in a session variable. So be prepared to write some kind of module to be able to interact with that. So just a listing of some of the modules that I talked about, and these are all very Drupal 7 specific. Drupal 6 has a lot more modules that work for geolocation, geocoding, and integrating with Drupal. One of my favorites is there's actually one that integrates geocoding with the context module, so you can hide entire blocks or change the lookout of your page. It's pretty handy. And which one is it? GeoCode, just so you know, isn't on Drupal.org. You got to pull it down from Git, but it does work. And just some pay IP services. MaxMine, you'll find a lot on Drupal.org. A lot of people write modules for both the free and pay versions of it. So if you do want to go the pay way, that's the way to go. IP2 location is a cheaper one out there that you can buy, a database, and they do offer both a service and the download. And the Smart IP module does actually use the IP location on their service. So you're pretty much getting that database with info or IP InfoDB. That's one that Smart IP uses. So you have pay and free, pay and free.
Right and wrong.
That's a $1 million statement there. So for some more information, the top one there is a OpenLayers presentation by Patrick Hayes, and it's a really good talk. It actually replaces the demo that I was going to do that wasn't working. He goes in pretty deep on a lot of the things that OpenLayers can do. It does get a little technical, but it's a great video to see OpenLayers in action. Just keep in mind that it is OpenLayers on Drupal 6 and not on Drupal 7. I've also included the OpenLayers documents that you can go through. Some are great, some are a little less than great. And then this is the actual OpenJS library. If you have to create your own module to interact with your own data because there isn't a third-party one out there that does exactly what you want, it's probably what you'll be interfacing and referencing the documents from. Okay, so if anyone wants the link to the slideshow is up there. What type of questions do you have? For the user resolution, I will trust it in the US down to state for the most part. Yeah. Country is almost always right. The good news is all the times that I've had to do it, there were country restrictions that I was working with, like you can't sell alligator-based stuff in the Middle East. So I was able to check that quite easily. Yes?
The other one for like location and Gmaps compared to OpenLayers, would you rather use, I mean, why would you recommend that one, I guess, than
Okay, so why would I use OpenLayers over GMap or compare it to something else? I tend to like OpenLayers because it's a full project on its own that's constantly evolving. They're putting out new versions. Some of the ones like Gmaps and the location module are kind of falling behind from what I've seen. They're good modules, but I tend to go with OpenLayers because you can actually change out what your map is. So if you're using Gmap and they change your terms of service, in a couple clicks you could change to a different rendering engine or a different mapping engine. Yes?
Do most of the bugs rely on or have to do with the amount of actual points on the map? Like if there's a lot?
And so the question was, do the bugs tend to lie with the number of points that show on a map? It's a difficult one. It is a big problem.
My experience has been, I've seen two problems. One has to do, you have to get an accurate IP address, where they're located. In other words, you have to convert that to longitude and latitude.
Yeah.
If you can't get that right, then nothing else is going to be right.
Well, that is the whole geocoding part is a kind of a fragile part of the process. If you're looking up the house next door and for some reason the geocoder says it's 2 states away, you're relying on that information. You don't really have a way to verify it other than checking against a third-party service. And also looking up IP addresses is kind of hit or miss. They're getting better, but it's still iffy.
Yeah, and so the other aspect that can be wrong is that these systems rely on geospatial data sitting in someone's database. So in the US, everyone that has something in production now is probably sitting with census data from 10 years ago. A lot of sites haven't updated the 2010 census.
Well, a lot of it depends on the quality of your data. Like I've used IP2 location before for their IP lookup tables, and I believe they update quarterly. So I just have a job that runs once a quarter to update information. For the census, you're going to have to take that up with the government, though. Yeah, so it can be iffy. I always recommend you check your data as best as possible. The other thing is I've seen for some bugs is check in the middle of the Atlantic because if they map to nowhere, they tend to go there. So you'll see an island in the middle of nowhere of pointers. Are there any other questions?
So if you're loading, if you're integrating with views and you're trying to bring in the results that are, say, 100 points, right?
Yep.
And you're using the module that you OpenLayers, will that essentially be smart enough to say, to encode them all at once and bring them back, or are they going through and doing a request for every single one and encoding them?
The view will dump, okay, so the question was if you're running a view and it returns 100 points, does it have to keep going back for all of the, was it encoding you're looking for?
Yeah, GeoCode.
Yeah, so the GeoCode is done on node save. So with the GeoField and GeoCode, it saves off that information already encoded.
Oh.
And so when you pull the view, it's going to return all 100 at the same time. Yeah, so it says a local cache, so don't ever map anything moving. Yes?
Is there a session variable that shows whether you're connected to someone on a mobile?
So if you're using a mobile device?
Yeah.
You would probably have to use some type of browser sniffing to determine that. I've seen some people that have used IP detection to see if it's part of a block that's to a mobile company, but that's very unreliable.
We'll need stuck to the headers. That's one way. Or you can look at the screen size. It's kind of reliable.
Yeah, there's no like browser flag equals true that the browser is going to return to you. You're going to have to look at what the headers and what the browser string is, or the IP address, or the screen size, or a combination.
Server side, obviously, you got to do it.
Yeah.
You can't rely on that.
BrowseCap module.
Yeah, I use BrowseCap. There's a module for Drupal called browser or mobile tools, and it ties in with the BrowseCap module, and it can help you detect what type of browser someone's using.
Would it be black hat or white hat or nothing to drop like a flash cookie on them and then when they come back check that?
But what would your flash cookie contain?
I don't know. it's just an idea, like maybe I can connect some of the other data on there. Maybe I'm thinking everything cookie.
I mean, you could just put a standard cookie and it would still live in the domain as long as one, they didn't delete it, and two, the lifespan was long enough. But if someone's moving or something like that, you can't tell where necessarily they'll be.
If you said this, you might pass by caching.
Yeah.
Reverse proxy. You mean outgoing or incoming? I don't understand.
Somebody comes to your site and they start using the geolocation, and that's the session that starts bypassing.
Okay, so the question is, if you're using like a proxy service, will that mess with your geolocation? Yes, in a good way. I actually use it to test. I use proxies from all over the world, and there's a couple services you can pay for that you can essentially proxy to their server in Russia, and then hit your site and test to see if it's actually picking up your information properly. So it can be helpful and hurtful. There's nothing you can do about proxy users if they want to get around it. How many people do I know wanted to use Spotify before it came over to America and use a British proxy? Are there any other questions? Okay, well, we're just on time. If the people who ask questions want to come up, I got some Florida Drupal Camp shirts. They're all extra large, but they're yours.